You certainly want to tell your doctor if you're starting CBD and you're on blood thinners or medications for epilepsy or immunosuppressant medications. And what this really comes down to is we need to destigmatize the conversation around cannabis so that we can have open communication, because the worst case scenario is that patients are using cannabinoids, medical cannabis, and that there are these like two parallel, non-intersecting medical systems, and that nobody knows what anybody else is doing, and that we're having these drug interactions.
Hi everybody, and welcome to Different Leaf, a show for new and experienced cannabis consumers. I'm Brit Smith. Maybe it's the start of spring, or maybe it's this new grape-flavored strain that I'm smoking on right now, but for me, 2021 already feels like it's full of new possibilities. We're just a few months into the new year, and already there are several states where marijuana-related bills look like they're going to pass through their state legislatures. And some of them may surprise you, like South Carolina, Alabama, and Tennessee. We'll have more on that news after our interview. But today, we're going to talk about what it could mean for you if you're living in a state that either already allows for medical marijuana or could allow it by the end of the year. This episode, our friendly neighborhood cannabis specialist, Dr. Peter Grinspoon, is going to answer some of our listeners' questions about medical marijuana. So if you sent in some questions, listen up. You may know Dr. Grinspoon from one of our prior episodes. He's a Harvard-educated primary care doctor who specializes in medical marijuana. He's on the staff at Massachusetts General Hospital, and he's a certified health coach who's written the book Free Refills, A Doctor Confronts His Addiction. Hi, Dr. Grinspoon, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. We are now at our 1-year anniversary of Different Leaf, so feeling pretty good about what we've done in the pandemic so far.
Congratulations. That's a huge accomplishment.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been an interesting one trying to make a podcast from, inside our houses, but we're pretty proud of what we've done so far. Going well. And we're so glad to have you back on the show again, our kind of go-to knowledgeable doctor. And today we're answering some audience questions. We've had a lot of people reach out, a lot of people who have listened to you on our show before and have heard you on other shows, and they want to tap your brain. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this today.
That kind of presupposes that there is a brain up there somewhere.
We're hoping there is one in there, yeah. Did you bring it?
I might have left part of it in clinic, but I think there's a little bit there left. Everybody's
kind of got mush brain from the pandemic. I think it's understandable, but we appreciate you do what you can. So our first question, this one comes from two people that were really interested in basically what the difference is between medical and recreational marijuana. We had @GGardner09 on Twitter ask specifically what is the difference between medical and recreational marijuana, and @FoodIsInfused on Instagram asked, is all cannabis medical marijuana? So how do you differentiate?
Well, that's sort of a complicated question, so I'm glad that we have 6 hours to discuss it. No, the thing is, some people say that all cannabis use is medical use, and I can understand where they're coming from, but I don't personally ascribe to that point of view. What it comes down to a little bit is definitions and semantics, how you define medical use. I mean, sure, cannabis is usually a large part of its medical use, obviously, anxiety, sleep, pain, et cetera, other things that we traditionally certify people for medically is medical use. But if people are using it to relax or to feel spiritual or to appreciate music or art, or to connect with other people, that's sort of in the gray zone. Mm-hmm. That's enhancing your life. That's wellness. Is that medical use or is that not medical use? It sort of depends how you define medical use. But I don't think that's that hard to define that as medical use in a sense, because that is enhancing your wellness. And These days, wellness is increasingly recognized as a part of medicine. It's not just about fixing what's wrong, but it's like, I've recently become trained as a health and wellness coach, and it's so much about finding out what makes you happy, not just what makes you not unhappy, and what makes you healthy, not what makes you not unhealthy. So I think that wellness is a very important part of health. So sure, those definitions of cannabis you can plausibly say are part of medical use. But what about just fun? Like people get high before a concert. Like think of me in high school or college I should say college. Not that we'd ever use in high school. Me in college getting high before a Grateful Dead concert. That was pure fun. It was more fun if you got high beforehand.
And now it's what we would call recreational use.
Right, exactly. Or adult use, if we want to try to get rid of the word recreational. But so that's fun. So on the one hand, you could say, sure, fun is good for you. Everybody knows that fun is healthy. So you could say that's medical use. But I think that's sort of a stretch. I mean, fun is fun. It's not, while fun is good for you, it's not really medical use. I mean, going out to the movies isn't like taking your medicine or going to the doctor. That's sort of a stretch. So I actually think people do use cannabis a lot of the time just recreationally, and it's not medical use.
But when it comes to the actual purchasing of substances, is anything different on the product side, on the med and the rec side?
There's a huge overlap, and it's been studied, something like, a huge percentage, I have the study right in my head, a huge percentage of people that buy cannabis recreationally use it medically. Just because they don't see a doctor and spend a couple $100s and get a card doesn't mean they're not using it for their headache or their chronic pain. There's a huge overlap. And the products are very similar. I would say medically, there's less emphasis on like the super high THC, and there's more an emphasis on CBD, which combined with THC tends to work well for anxiety, chronic pain, insomnia, and I think CBD is also going to prove very interesting for addiction, and we use it for pediatric epilepsy and so forth. But so I think that there are nuances, but generally speaking, if you go to a store, there tend to be the same stores. It's just like different section of the stores.
And when it comes to the flower, it is the same flower if they're selling the same strain on both sides. There's nothing different about that flower, right?
Right. No, it's exactly the same flower. And a lot of the descriptions are very overlapping too. You could even question whether a lot of the strains are that different. They all have the description, causes a calm euphoria that leads to a happy, relaxing state of mind that is good for chronic pain and anxiety. I mean, the definitions are just so similar of all the strains, and it just makes you wonder like how different some of them really are.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually leads us nicely into our next question. Lola Gideon on Twitter asked what strains are good for nausea without the high. And our pen Hannah on Instagram asked, are there types or strains that will help you sleep without causing anxiety, which was her experience as a teen. So how is it that we can consume different strains to avoid getting that high or paranoia?
Those are two sort of different questions that have a common thing about the strains. So let me talk about the strains, and then I'll talk about the nausea, and then I'll talk about the anxiety. So first of all, with the strains, people think is the wrong word, because it's not, strains doesn't really mean anything. It's just what we've been calling it. But it should be called chemovar, because what really matters is what the different... chemovar. Chemo, like chemical, var. Like chemovar is what like all the scientists use, because a strain doesn't really mean anything. Like a strain is just like the different strains aren't really different strains. That's not like the right botanical word for it. Mm-hmm. And a chemovar is like how much CBG is in it, how much CBD is in it, what the different terpenes are. When you buy it at the dispensary, it has that little printout of like what's actually in it.
Yeah,
that is the chemovar, the different chemical print.
It's all the range of cannabinoids, like all
exactly
the
cannabinoids and the terpenes, and as time goes on, we're going to get more and more sophisticated analysis of what's in, and not just analysis of what's in the cannabis, but an understanding of what the different components do, and an ability to manipulate and control. I want this effect, so let's put these different chemicals in it. And the strains don't really tell you much, like. There's so many different strains, and each celebrity comes out and has their own strain, and the strains aren't even consistent at one dispensary. They don't have the same strains.
Yeah.
They've studied sour diesel at different dispensaries, and it's like totally different. They studied different strains at the same dispensary, and they all are very similar. with some differences. I mean, there have been a lot of studies that strains don't really mean that much necessarily. I mean, there's some difference, just like there's some difference between sativa and indica, but generally speaking, they've been bred together over the last 4 or 5 decades. Sativas used to be these really tall plants, and indicas used to be these short, scrubby plants. And then during the war on Reagan's war on drugs, you could see the sativas from the sky, and all the outdoor growers would get busted. So they started hybridizing them with the short, scrubby indicas so that you couldn't see them from the helicopters. And then so most of what we have now is, these hybrids. So people talk about sativa makes you uplifted, indica makes you relaxed, but most of what we have has just been a mixture of the sativas and the indica. So that's sort of an artificial distinction, unless you're talking about like a landrace strain, like a really pure strain of indica from like the Himalayas, like a Kush, or a pure sativa strain like Durban poison from South Africa. But generally speaking, most of the sativa indica strain is sort of nonsense. And the same with this.
Whoa, I'm sorry. Hold the phone. That blew my mind. It was because they were taller plants and they bred them to. Gosh, the war on drugs had such an impact. It had such an impact on the genetics.
Absolutely.
So what they're selling me as certain strain names, and like Gorilla Glue #4 is really no different to Gorilla Glue #1. Is that what have I been duped this whole time? That's what you're telling me.
Well, there's some difference among the strains, but not nearly as much difference as you'd think. Wow. Given how much marketing and emphasis goes on it.
Yeah.
And I mean, don't you sort of notice that when you go to a dispensary, I mean, I'm going to get in so much trouble for saying this, but don't you sort of notice when you go to the dispensary that the descriptions are very overlapping?
Yeah.
And then I was with my older brother, David, and we were just looking up the lineage of some of these strains. And it was really funny. It was like this and this bred this, and then this and this bred this. And then it was circular, like it was totally impossible. Like this and this bred the first thing. And it's like, wait a minute, that can't possibly be true. It was like a circular thing, which is literally impossible. We were both laughing. So, I mean, maybe Leafly just made a mistake. But I just think that there's so much marketing and there is difference between the strains. But it makes it hard to answer the question of like what strains are good for nausea. You look at different articles, and every article has different strains that are good for nausea. Like there's no consistency. And again, some of the articles say sour diesel, but what is sour diesel? Now they have East Coast sour diesel and West Coast sour diesel.
I was going to say it kind of depends on where you're living and where you're growing as well.
Right. It depends. Indoor, outdoor, the genetics, the pH of this, the nutrients, but there's just not that much consistency. And that's why I think they named it East Coast and West Coast sour diesel in response to the criticism that the sour diesel that you buy in San Francisco is completely different than the sour diesel that you get in Boston.
Yeah.
So, and when it comes to anxiety, I think what's much more important is the dose, because it's biphasic. Like in low doses, it's very helpful with anxiety, and in high doses, it can cause anxiety.
Now, this is THC heavy.
Yeah, exactly. Cannabis that has a lot of THC in it, which most cannabis does, because it's just more recently that they've been breeding back the CBD. It used to be that there was a lot more CBD. And then again, as you mentioned, because of the war on drugs, the premium was on high THC because that was economical to smuggle. Now that it's becoming legalized, like all things, as you make it legal, drugs are much safer. The CBD is becoming bred back up. So, but yeah, high THC, it's biphasic. So the higher THC, the more anxiety you can get, which is why with patients that are coming in for anxiety, I really, really emphasize the start low and go slow. And like the last thing you want is someone who's not particularly familiar with cannabis to go in and get upsold products by the bud tenders and then say, oh, this 100 milligram brownie looks delicious. I'm going to eat the whole thing. And then they freak out and then they don't want anything to do with medical cannabis ever again. And people just have to be cautioned that if you take too much, it could make the anxiety much, much worse. You've got to just find the right dose. And dose is more important. I just want to say dose is more important than strain, if you ask me, when it comes to anxiety. And also it's important to have a hefty component of CBD in it.
I was going to ask, actually, so do you think it's a good idea for people that are trying to figure out their dose at first and obviously figure out not necessarily what strain works for them, but what product works for them. Is it a good idea for them to have some CBD on hand?